Hey guys, what's up? Ehren here, Question Period Canada. It's hard to know if my poppy's on the right or left side because I can do that trick and change the sides. Anyhow, we've got an exciting episode lined up for you tonight. Question Period Canada, we're going to try something different. I normally just cut up the live video that I do earlier in the evening, add some special effects, cut some things out. We're trying something much different this time. I think you'll enjoy it. Let me know what you think. Put it in the comments. Let me know. I need to know. We're going to jump right into it as we normally do and see if you notice the differences. Hope you enjoy.
Oral questions. Questions orales. L'honorable.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The Prime Minister is desperate to save his carbon tax, especially on heat. And he started by giving a temporary pause to some people in a region where he was plummeting in the polls and his caucus was revolting. But then he found that the entire country was in revolt and he needed a new coalition partner to save him from my common sense confidence vote to take the heat off, to take the tax off the heat. He got that support from the Bloc Québécois. We now learn that he has been in discussions with the Bloc to help him stay in power for 2 years. What did he promise the separatists for them to enter into this costly carbon tax coalition?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, contrary to the divisive rhetoric that the Leader of the Opposition is putting forward, the measures we announced on transitioning people on oil to heat pumps apply right across the country. The doubling of the rural top-up right across the country. We're going to continue to work with Canadians to phase out home heating oil, which is dirtier and more expensive. And I want to recognize that we are willing to work with anyone in this House who will step up in the fight against climate change. And I thank the Leader of the Bloc Québécois for continuing to be firm on building a better future for all our kids, on fighting for climate change, against climate change on this and in other occasions. I welcome all parliamentarians to stand up in the fight against climate change.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Now he's thanking the separatists for helping him save his carbon tax and support his plan to quadruple the tax on heat, gas, and groceries. This Prime Minister is playing a very dangerous game. First, he divided Canadians by giving a temporary pause to some people in a region where he was plummeting in the polls and his caucus was revolting. When all Canadians then revolted against this divisive plan, he's turned to the separatists who say that they are going to keep him in power for 2 years and that the Leader of the Bloc has had a call with the Prime Minister to do it. In the interest of transparency, will the Prime Minister reveal what he promised the separatists for them to join in this costly carbon tax coalition?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the level of divisiveness and the rhetoric of the Leader of the Opposition is truly unfortunate. Mr. Speaker, the vast majority of Canadians, like the vast majority of members in this House of Commons, recognize that climate change is real, recognize we need to continue to step up in the fight against climate change, not just for the well-being of the planet and future generations, but for families' bottom lines, for families' jobs and careers as well, and we will continue to do that. As members of this party know, of the House of Commons know, I exchange regularly with leaders of different political parties. I haven't spoken recently with the Leader of the Bloc except on the issue of the Middle East, but I'm always open to talking to any party leader that wants to talk about fighting climate change.
L'Honorable Chef de l'Opposition.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Divide and distract from the fact that Canadians, after 8 years of his government, cannot eat, heat, or house themselves. But in a strange way, he united all Canadians at the Premier's conference, who all agree, all 10 of them unanimously disagree that the Prime Minister's approach to take the tax off temporarily for only some. They said that this federal carbon tax policy treats Canadians differently and they expect a change. Will the Prime Minister pull together all the premiers in an emergency carbon tax conference so that we can take the tax off and keep the heat on?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the measures we announced a couple of weeks ago help any Canadian everywhere across the country to get off home heating oil towards using a heat pump, which is cleaner, less expensive, and better for our future. These are things that we've done right across the country. Only the Conservatives would think that taking serious action on climate change and supporting Canadians right across the country with affordability measures would be divisive. Well, it is divisive if you think that climate change is fake. But for everybody else other than the Conservative Party, we know that we can come together to fight climate change.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Canadians know that the only thing fake is this Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, today the NDP flip-flopped on its flip-flop. First, they voted 16 times in favor of the carbon tax on home heat. Then they voted to quadruple the tax. Then yesterday, they panicked and flip-flopped and voted for my plan to take the tax off home heating, admitting that they were wrong all along. And now today, they said they're in favor of the tax on home heat by refusing my amendment. So will the Prime Minister tell us at 2:26 p.m. what is the NDP position on the carbon tax right now?
Not certain if that has to do with the administration. That question has to do with the administration of the House. But I do see the Right Honourable Prime Minister rising to his feet. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what is clear is that the Conservatives are all ready to try and divide Canadians one against the other in any possible way they can, when the reality is the only division around climate change is that Conservative politicians still doubt whether it's real or not, and certainly don't think we should be doing anything to fight climate change. However, everybody else across the country, in all different parties, knows that it's a real issue that we're going to continue to step up and fight, unlike the Conservatives that continue to look to divide and hide from the reality of climate change.
Hear, hear.
So at least Trudeau showed up. He hasn't been around lately. I think Poilievre has him scared. Who do you think won those arguments? I think you know. Up next, Jagmeet Singh takes a swing at Trudeau. It's kind of weird, but let's take a peek.
The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
I know that the Prime Minister's plan on home heating was cynical and divisive, but the Conservatives are no better. They're more interested in playing games than actually helping people, because if they were genuine about helping people, they would support our plan to take GST off of home heating for all Canadians, to help people access clean and affordable ways to heat their home, and to make the big oil and gas companies pay for it. But we know that the corporate Conservatives won't ever stand up to big oil and gas, but will the Prime Minister support our plan to help all Canadians?
Hear, hear.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we know that one of the things that helps Canadians is fighting climate change and supporting them in that fight against climate change. I know the NDP used to support phasing out coal. It is surprising to me that they are not supportive of phasing out heating oil, because that's exactly what we are doing. We're phasing out home heating oil because it is dirtier and more expensive for homes right across the country, and we're facilitating the delivery of heat pumps, including for free for low-income Canadians in provinces that choose to step up and participate. We're going to continue to fight climate change. I really wish the NDP were as unequivocal as that.
I thought Jagmeet and Justin were supposed to be a part of a coalition government, not going at it. It's just weird, the coalition government. However, up next, Melissa Lantsman, so this will be fun. With her cowlick and those eyes, she shoots this look after she delivers her questions. It's fun.
The Honourable Member from Thornhill.
Prime Minister paused the paying of his carbon tax for 3% of families in region where he is plummeting in the polls. The Liberal minister from Newfoundland said if people in other regions wanted the same pause, that they should have elected Liberals. But people in York region elected Liberal MPs. In fact, 7 of them, and yet their constituents aren't getting the pause. Right. Yesterday, these MPs could have voted to take the tax off for the residents of York region, but they voted with the Prime Minister. So can anybody from York region stand up and explain their choice to leave their constituents in the cold?
Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I have said a number of times in this House, we have taken action that addresses affordability for particularly vulnerable Canadians. Heating oil costs 2 to 4 times that of natural gas. It accelerated by 75% in 2022, but we've done it in a manner that addresses the climate crisis at the same time and ensures affordability for people going forward. It will save $2,500 a year. It applies to people who live in every province and territory in this country, so long as provinces and territories step up. The shame in this chamber is that this party has no plan to address the climate crisis. I don't even know if they believe it, but they certainly don't act as though they actually think it's important.
Member from Thornhill.
It certainly doesn't help the people in Newmarket, in Aurora, in Richmond Hill, in Woodbridge, in Markham, in Stouffville, or in North York. All of these communities got sold out by their Liberal MPs, and they can't even tell people why. They had a choice to stand with their communities, and instead they stood with the Prime Minister, and now they're hiding and hoping that everybody forgets. If these MPs won't listen to their constituents, won't advocate for them in the House of Commons, and won't even stand to defend their vote, then what are they even doing here?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This policy choice is about both affordability and about ensuring that we are addressing the climate crisis. I call on all provinces and territories to join us, certainly the Government of Ontario. Ontario has indicated an interest in moving forward with us on co-delivering this project, which would be enormously important going forward. But I would say, Mr. Speaker, that yesterday the Leader of the Opposition essentially said that he will walk away from Canada's climate targets, eroding the Canada's credibility in the international community, eroding the ability of the world to address the climate crisis. This is enormously reckless, Mr. Speaker. It is an enormous risk for the future of our children. Shame on him.
So I'm pretty sure Melissa Lantsman got the better of those exchanges. That was Jonathan Wilkinson. He's an MP from Ontario. He's also the Minister of Natural Resources. Sometimes he's fun to watch. He does a lot of finger pointing, wagging. It is fun to watch. Anyhow, on to the next. Up next is Scott Aitchison. He's an MP from Ontario. He's got a question first for Jonathan Wilkinson, and then he's going to follow that up with a question for the MP from Newfoundland, Seamus O'Regan. Remember the weird little guy from CTV? He's an MP now.
Member from Parry Sound, Muskoka.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister paused the paying of his carbon tax for 3% of Canadians in regions where he was plummeting in the polls. Then the Liberal Rural Affairs Minister said if people in other regions wanted the same pause, well, they should elect Liberals. But the people of Sudbury did elect a Liberal MP, and yet her constituents aren't getting a break. Yesterday, she could have voted to pause the carbon tax on all forms of home heating for the residents of Sudbury. But she voted no. Wow. Why is this government so committed to quadrupling their carbon tax that they forced the member for Sudbury to leave her constituents out in the cold?
Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have a serious plan, real policy that addresses affordability, but also addresses the climate crisis. The Leader of the official opposition has no plan. He mouths taglines like technology, not taxes. These coming from a guy who actually has zero background in technology, zero background in business. This coming from somebody who has been opposing the deployment of offshore wind technology through the passage of Bill C-49, something that is actually supported by the Conservative Premier of Nova Scotia and the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador. Shame on them, having no plan for climate change, having no plan for the economy of the future.
Well, just this morning, the Environment Commissioner confirmed that this government's so-called climate plan is nothing more than a punishing tax on heat, gas, and groceries. And after yesterday's vote, it is crystal clear that this NDP Liberal government has no plan to make life more affordable either. Yesterday, the member for Sault Ste. Marie could have voted to pause the carbon tax on home heating for all the residents of the Soo and all of Northern Ontario. But he voted no. Why is this government so committed to quadrupling the carbon tax that they forced the member for Sault Ste. Marie to leave his constituents out in the cold?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, there is an equity thing that's happening here. Treating all folks equally, when they start out unequal, that just perpetuates an inequality. It costs 4 times as much to heat your home on heating oil as it does natural gas, and that is a particular problem when you live in a region like me that does not have access to natural gas. Let us pick up for those people hardest hit, Mr. Speaker. Let's make sure that they get the break that they deserve. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I don't know what to think about Seamus O'Regan. Is he a little jerk or is he a little clown? Is he kind of funny? Maybe he's all those things, who knows? Up next, Eric Malilo. He's another Ontario MP and he's got more questions for Jonathan Wilkinson.
The honourable member from Kenora.
The Prime Minister has paused the paying of his carbon tax for 3% of families in areas where he is plummeting in the polls. And the Liberal Rural Affairs Minister says if others wanted a similar pause, well, they should have elected more Liberals. Mr. Speaker, the people of Thunder Bay Rainy River did elect a Liberal MP, yet they are not seeing this pause. And just yesterday, that member had an opportunity to vote to take the tax off and keep the heat on, but he voted against our common sense motion. So, Mr. Speaker, why is this government so committed to quadrupling the carbon tax that the member from Thunder Bay Rainy River left the people of Northern Ontario outside in the cold?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I have said before, we put forward a plan that addresses affordability in the long term for vulnerable Canadians who are suffering from high costs associated with home heating oil that has accelerated significantly in the last 2 years, but done it in a manner that is consistent with the fight against climate change, a fight that is not just Canadian, but is happening in countries around the world. I would say, Mr. Speaker, that it is the height of hypocrisy for the member opposite to be talking about this, about a price on pollution that they endorsed in their campaign platform and was part of the basis on which he was elected to this House.
Mr. Speaker, they have absolutely no plan for affordability after 8 years, which must be why the Prime Minister has paused his carbon tax paying for 3% of families. But people in Thunder Bay Superior North want to know why their MP, a Liberal minister, wasn't able to get the same pause for people across Northern Ontario. And just yesterday, she had the opportunity to vote to keep the heat on and take the tax off of people across Northern Ontario. So again, Mr. Speaker, why is this government so committed to quadrupling their carbon tax that the member from Thunder Bay Superior North was forced to leave the people of Northern Ontario out in the cold?
Member, the Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've said a number of times, it is shameful that the party opposite has no plan to address a crisis that is a crisis facing all of humanity. But I would tell you, in the modern age, having a recognition and acceptance of the realities of climate change is critical to having an economic plan that can be relevant for the future. What we hear is the Leader of the Opposition will cancel the Volkswagen battery manufacturing plant, that he opposes offshore wind and hydrogen development in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, that he would get rid of the Canada Infrastructure Bank, that would eliminate the small modular reactor project at Darlington. He is opposed to everything, and at the end of the day, he has no plan for the economy and he has no plan for the environment. There you go.
How about Eric Malilo? Easy on the ears and eyes. He's smooth. Wilkinson did pretty well today, spoke a bunch of times, really only made 1 point, but boy did he point that finger, so that's a lot of fun. Up next, Jenny Kwan, always about housing issues. She's an NDP MP. And the answer is going to be given by Jean-Yves Duclos. He has a really interesting way of speaking. It's just different.
The honourable member from Vancouver East.
The Liberals are out of touch with Canadians struggling to find a home that they can afford. They just handed over 6 parcels of federal land to wealthy developers, and only a small fraction of the homes built will be affordable. We're in a housing crisis. Rent is through the roof. Canadians are having to make impossible choices. Some end up living in cars or on the street. Canada needs at least 2 million non-profit homes. So why are the Liberals putting profits over people having an affordable home yet again?
Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to our colleague for raising the importance of investing in more housing. The good news is that we've just done that this morning. Through this morning with Canada Lands Company, we announced the construction of 28,000 additional new homes in the next 5 years. 20% of them at least will be affordable homes, which is 5 times the amount of affordable homes that we have constructed in the last 30 years. Mr. Speaker, there is more to do, including with non-profit housing providers. We're going to do that.
Bravo.
Jenny Kwan and Jean-Yves Duclos have really funny ways of talking. I understand a French accent, but I've never heard one like Jean's. That's different. But up next is Clark Kent. You might know him as John Barlow. He's a no-nonsense type of politician. He and Jonathan Wilkinson really do butt heads here. It's entertaining.
The honourable member from Foothills.
The Prime Minister's Christmas gift to 97% of Canadians. Merry Christmas. You're going to have a carbon tax in your home heating this winter. The Prime Minister literally gave Canadians a lump of coal by voting against a common-sense Conservative motion to take the tax off and keep the heat on. Now, we thought the Liberal NDP's carbon tax coalition was bad, but there's a new addition to the carbon tax naughty list. The Bloc joined the Liberals and voted to keep the carbon tax on home heating this winter. Which gift did the Prime Minister leave under the separatist tree to protect his government for 2 more years?
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've said a number of times, it is important to actually have a plan to address critical affordability issues in a long-term way, but also to continue to address the climate crisis. Those are the measures that we have put into place. I have to say again that I do find it the height of hypocrisy that my honourable colleague across the way, who ran on a platform that included putting a price on pollution, gets up in the House today and actually says what he's saying. It is the height of hypocrisy.
The honourable member from Foothills.
The Prime Minister joined the separatists to divide Canadians. Those Canadians will have to pay a carbon tax on their home heating over the winter, and 3% of Canadians who will get a pause on the pain. It's clear that the Liberals and the Bloc, their Christmas gift to Canadians is to punish families for heating their homes this winter. They voted against a common-sense Conservative motion to take the tax off for every single Canadian. Again, what Christmas wish did the Prime Minister grant the separatists for the Liberals to avoid an election on the carbon tax?
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources.
You know, Mr. Speaker, I think every party in this House actually is concerned about affordability issues, but the only party in this House that does not care about the climate crisis is the Conservative Party of Canada. The only party that actually has no plan to address it and doesn't even believe that climate change is real. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, the Leader of the Opposition essentially said he would walk away from Canada's climate targets, walk away from every member of the international community. He would walk away from our children's future, and he would walk away from a clean economy that will actually create jobs and economic opportunity across the country. Shame on him.
So what do you think about John Barlow? He looks like Clark Kent a whole lot. I used to think he was a geek, but now I kind of like him. Really well spoken, pretty sharp. Jonathan Wilkinson fired back pretty well too, but he's been on the floor too much and I don't think his energy is gonna last. Up next, we have Rick Perkins, who's an MP from Nova Scotia here. He's got more questions for guess who? John Wilkinson.
Honourable member from South Shore, St. Margaret's.
After 8 years, the revolting Atlantic Caucus and the panicking, plummeting Prime Minister now have 2 coalitions with which to flip Canadians the bird. The costly coalition with the NDP to drive the cost of everything up. Unfortunately, Canadians know too much about that. The other, according to the Quebec media, is with the separatist Bloc, who committed to keep the Liberals in power for another 2 years. The costly coalition Prime Minister is not worth the cost. Will the Prime Minister release his full carbon tax coalition agreement with the separatist Bloc?
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think my honourable friend across the way used the word revolting. You know what is revolting? Are the tactics, the circus act that is going on in the Natural Resources Committee, blocking the passage of Bill C-49. It is endangering the health and safety of the translators in that committee. It is an enormous waste of taxpayers' money. It is opposing the Premier of Nova Scotia, the Conservative Premier of Nova Scotia, and the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador. It will create jobs and economic opportunity for the future in a manner that is consistent with fighting the climate crisis. Shame on him.
So Rick Perkins stumbled on his words there. Sometimes he's really articulate, sometimes he misses everything. That time he missed a lot. And I kind of think Jonathan Wilkinson made a better point answering his question than the point the question was trying to make. I'm not sure. Up next, we have Tracy Gray. She's an MP from British Columbia. She has a question for guess who? That's right, Jonathan Wilkinson. He's carrying the weight of the Liberal Party on his back today.
Kelowna Lake Country.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Liberals voted down our common-sense Conservative motion to axe the carbon tax on all forms of home heating for all Canadians. Now, the NDP leader said his NDP MPs would be supporting our Conservative motion to keep the heat on. However, not all British Columbia NDP MPs voted to take the carbon tax off. Now, after 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, this Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. Will the Prime Prime Minister quit forcing British Columbians' rates on British Columbia for the carbon tax rates, which he plans to quadruple on home heating?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I have been saying, we have a plan to ensure long-term affordability for particularly vulnerable Canadians. The cost of heating oil is 2 to 4 times that of natural gas, depending on which province you live in. It is accelerated over 75% in 2022. It is a plan that actually addresses that in a way that will give savings to people over the long term. It will do it in a manner that fights climate change. I had the opportunity to speak with Premier Ehren about it last week, and I believe that the people in British Columbia will have access to exactly the same proposal as everywhere else.
Not a bad question by Tracy, not the most exciting. You can tell that Jonathan Wilkinson is getting tired though, running out of steam. Up next, another blonde MP for the Conservatives from out west. This is Rachel Dowd. She has a question for Mark Holland. He's Minister of Health. He's also an MP from Ontario.
So what I heard from the member opposite is that this government is committed to picking winners and losers, and the winners are the 3% that use oil to heat their homes. They won't have to pay a carbon tax for the next 3 years, but the rest of Canada will. When the Minister for Rural Affairs was asked about this, she said, well, they just need to vote more Liberals in place and then we'll give them our attention, referring to those in other parts of the country, of course. Now, for those that live in the constituency of Edmonton Centre, they did elect a Liberal Member of Parliament, and yet they were not showing that favoritism. They were not showing the benefit of having the carbon tax removed. And so my question is simple. Why is this government so hell-bent that the people of Edmonton Centre still have to pay the carbon tax on their home heating?
The Honourable Minister for Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And of course, the members opposite know that more than 8 out of 10 Canadians get more back than they pay. But why are we hell-bent on this? Because our planet demands it. Mr. Speaker, 15,000, that's the number of Canadians who died prematurely as a result of air pollution in the country. That cost $114 billion. It is escalating. If we refuse to take action on this, not only do we have a moral and fiscal imperative, but we have an obligation to ensure the party opposite doesn't return to attacking climate policies across the world and move back to an aggressive state where we cease making the project on climate action, Mr. Speaker.
So that was our first boring interaction of the show. Rachel Dowd kind of let us down, didn't stick it to him enough. Mark Holland didn't react at all. Kind of boring. Up next, though, James Bizan. He's also an MP from Manitoba. Yesterday, he flipped out. It was hysterical. He's got a question for, guess who? Jonathan Wilkinson, and Wilkinson is getting tired.
Manitoba's new NDP Premier has joined the chorus calling on these Liberals to pause the carbon tax. After 8 long years, everyone knows that this Prime Minister is just not worth the cost, and his Liberal MPs in Winnipeg are failing Manitobans. Yesterday, the member for Winnipeg North could have voted to take the tax off and keep the heat on for Manitobans, but instead he voted to leave his constituents out in the cold. And now these Liberals want to quadruple the carbon tax. Why does the member from Winnipeg North always follow orders from his Prime Minister at the expense of his own constituents?
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've said a number of times, this is a policy that is about addressing affordability for folks who actually are suffering from the fact that heating oil is a much more expensive way to heat your home. We do this in a manner that actually will enable us to continue the fight against climate change and help folks in the long term with affordability concerns. I would tell you that we have had discussions with the Government of Manitoba. I look forward to being able to move forward on a joint basis with the Government of Manitoba, and I'm pleased to see the Government in Manitoba actually recognize the existence of climate change, something that the Honourable Opposition does not do.
So James Bizan from Manitoba kind of dropped the ball there. He's usually pretty good with his words. He stumbled on them there. It loses all effect. Good thing for Jonathan Wilkinson, though. He's getting tired. You can tell he's been carrying too much water for the Liberals today. Another MP, Ted Falk, got dusted off and had some of the best points made today. He was asking Stephen Guilbeault.
After 8 years, we now have the socialists, the separatists, and this Prime Minister who's just not worth the cost. They're all part of this costly carbon tax coalition that is leaving Canadians out in the cold. The Rural Affairs Minister recently told Manitobans that if they wanted the tax break, they had to elect more Liberals. Well, guess what? The folks in St. Boniface, St. Vital did elect a Liberal, and they're still paying the carbon tax. Yesterday, he had a chance to vote to keep the tax off and the heat on for his constituents. Why did that member choose to leave the members of St. Boniface, St. Vital in the cold?
The Minister for Environment and Climate Change.
We're talking, Mr. Speaker, so I was sitting. I'm a Liberal and a proud socialist, Mr. Speaker, but this reminds me of a certain quote from Prime Minister Harper, who talked about the fight against climate change as a socialist plot. That's what the Conservative Party, and here it is, you have it again, Mr. Speaker. They do not believe that climate change is an issue. They do not believe we should do anything about it. They oppose electrification of transportation. They oppose deals like Volkswagen, Stellantis, and Nordvolt. They oppose wind development off the shores of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. They have no plan to fight climate change. They have no plan for the economy. They have no plan for the future of Canada. Bravo!
So dear old Ted Falk did have the best question of the day, I thought had the most substance. Here's a question. Why does Stephen Guilbeault always freak out every time he's speaking French? He did there a little bit. Up next, an Ontario MP, Dan Moyes, has a question for you-know-who. No, not this time. We've got the boring clown, Karina Gould. I think she's showing.
Honourable Member from Flamborough-Glenbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The leader of the NDP said his caucus would be voting against the divisive decision by the Prime Minister to pause the payment of the carbon tax for just 3% of Canadians while doing nothing for the rest. However, in yesterday's vote, the member from Hamilton Centre didn't even bother to vote. If the NDP member from Hamilton Centre won't do his job, Conservatives will. Will the Prime Minister quit forcing Ontarians to pay a quadrupled carbon tax on their home heating?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if that member opposite is so concerned about helping Ontarians, then he should be asking the Premier of Ontario to join the program to provide free heat cards to the hundreds of thousands of Ontarians who would qualify. As he knows, and as every member in this House full well knows, this is a program that applies across the country to transition folks away from home heating oil so that they don't have dirty, more expensive ways to heat their home. We can do this for cheaper, and we can help Canadians both with affordability and the existential threat of fighting climate change, something that Conservatives continue to deny. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, very good.
We're getting down to the end of it now, just a couple of questions left. It went by pretty quick, right? Leah Gazan is a member of parliament from Manitoba, and she has a question for Jenna Sudds, who's a hippy-dippy-dippy. What kind of prescription is she on? Check it out.
Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Winnipeg's Christmas Cheer Board is anticipating record demand for their hampers due to the cost of living crisis. 19,000 requests so far this year. And while big corporations are jacking up food prices, the Liberals throw up their hands, and the Conservative leader, the corporate champion from Carleton, stays silent. The Christmas Cheer Board doesn't know if they can meet this demand for help. Will the government support the NDP's bill to lower food costs and give Winnipeg families the help they need? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from my colleague. We know right now that many Canadians are having a hard time putting food on the table, and that's exactly why we continue to do the hard work on this side of the House to support Canadian families and organizations doing that work, whether that's from the Community Services Recovery Fund or whether that's the work that we're doing to develop the national school food policy amongst our partners. We are here to support Canadian families, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Forgot to mention, would you believe Jenna Sudds is the Minister of Children, Families and Social Development? What a surprise, hippy-dippy-dippy, or flat line on a prescription. There's something up with that lady. For the last question of the day, we've got Laurie Oudlot, who's an MP from Nunavut, and she's got a question for Patty Hajdu And I'm not a fan of Patty at all. She looks like she's sick of being there, doesn't want to answer the questions. Anyways, best for last.
The honourable member from Nunavut.
The gap for First Nations infrastructure is at $350 billion. The government committed to end the gap for First Nations by 2030, but the Liberals have spent less than 3% of what is needed. This does not even include funding for Métis and Inuit, which would make the gap even more extreme. Indigenous communities remain neglected despite the calls for actions. When will this government recognize Indigenous people's capacity and work with them to fill these gaps?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague from Nunavut for this really important question. In fact, after a decade under the Harper government of no investments in First Nations communities, our government got to work with First Nations partners to start to close that infrastructure gap on things like clean water, Mr. Speaker, boil water advisories that have been left unattended for a decade, on things like housing, Mr. Speaker, community centres, health centres and schools. Mr. Speaker, I agree with the member opposite. The gap is huge, but we are making progress with Indigenous leadership, and I'm very proud of that.
And with that, we come to the end of question period. I do see a point of order. The honourable member from Provencher.
Hey everybody, so that wraps up tonight's show. Hope you enjoyed it, folks. This is a different format. You've got to let me know in the comments if you like it. It's supposed to flow more smoothly. Less translations, less downtime, making Canadian politics more fun. And that's what we're doing here. So like and subscribe. I'm Ehren. This is Question Period Canada. We'll catch you next time. Thanks for watching.